Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to unpack this incredibly intense, highly complex geopolitical analysis from economist and Professor Jeffrey Sachs.
Yeah, it is quite a document.
It really is. We're looking at a very detailed breakdown of the U.S.-Iran conflict, the specific strategies of the U.S. and Israel over the last few decades, and honestly, this looming threat of global economic devastation if the current regional escalation isn't stopped.
Right, and it's material that really forces you to, step back and look at the entire chessboard. It connects these historical dots that usually just get treated as isolated incidents.
Exactly. But before we get into those historical dots, I need to make something crystal clear to you listening. The sources we're diving into today touch on deeply polarizing, highly politically charged topics involving international conflicts, the U.S., Israel, and Iran. So I want to emphasize that neither of us are taking sides here, nor are we endorsing any of the specific viewpoints presented by the source. Our sole job is to impartially report on the ideas in this material, to help you understand the arguments being made, and basically just decode the history and strategy behind them.
Right, we're just here to act as your guides through the material. We're breaking down the mechanics of what the source is arguing without, tipping the scale.
Yeah, exactly. So to set the stage for why this matters so urgently, the source material frames our current moment as this terrifying fork in the road. On one side, there's a bitter, politically humiliating, but ultimately necessary diplomatic off-ramp.
And on the other side?
Right, on the other side is an uncontrolled regional escalation that our source argues won't just redraw borders, but could trigger a literal overnight collapse of the global economy.
Yeah, we are looking at a reeling global economic system that's heavily dependent on just a few incredibly fragile geopolitical choke points.
It's wild to think about.
It really is. Over the course of this deep dive, we're going to connect 1950s intelligence coups, modern religious zealotry, and, well, the actual tangible price you're going to pay for your groceries next month if this situation boils over.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the immediate economic threat, because the source points really heavily to the Strait of Hormuz. I want to try an analogy here.
Okay, let's hear it.
If the global economy is a massive automated factory, the Strait of Hormuz isn't just a shipping lane. It's like the main breaker switch for the entire supply chain.
That's a great way to put it.
But I'm struggling a bit with the sheer scale of the panic the source describes. I mean, is one stretch of water closing actually going to crash a global system that is supposedly highly diversified?
It absolutely will, and it's critical to understand the mechanics of why. It's not just about crude oil, though the Strait does handle about 20% of the world's energy supply.
Right.
It's about the raw materials required to literally sustain human life.
Yeah.
We're talking about 30% of the world's fertilizers moving through that specific corridor.
Wow, 30%.
Yeah, specifically urea. Urea is synthesized from natural gas produced in that region, and it's the primary nitrogen fertilizer used in global agriculture.
So if you shut down the flow of urea, you aren't just making farming more expensive, you are mechanically reducing the yield of global crops.
Exactly.
So it's a direct domino effect. The waterway closes, the fertilizer doesn't ship, the crops fail, and the food supply shrinks.
Add to that massive amounts of petrochemicals and key commodities like aluminum, which, require immense amounts of energy to smelt. The source actually draws a direct mechanical comparison to the 1973 and 1979 oil shocks.
Oh, right, the ones that caused massive global stagflation.
Yes.
Let's define stagflation for a second, because that's basically a nightmare scenario for economists. That's when inflation soars, meaning everything costs vastly more, but economic growth completely stalls out.
Right, so wages drop and unemployment spikes.
It's just the worst of both worlds.
And here is the terrifying difference the source points out between the 1970s and today. In the 70s, those were temporary political embargoes. A few governments essentially agreed to just, turn off the tap to exert political pressure.
So the infrastructure was fine.
Exactly. The infrastructure remained perfectly intact. A full-scale war today means physical destruction. You're talking about thousands of missiles raining down on multi-billion-dollar refineries, natural gas processing centers, and desalination plants.
Which are basically massive, custom-engineered labyrinths of specialized piping and tech. You don't just patch those up with duct tape.
No, not at all. They take years to rebuild under peaceful conditions, let alone in an active war zone. And there was a very specific detail in the source that highlights how seriously the financial sector is taking this threat.
What was that?
Well, the United Arab Emirates, which is famously one of the wealthiest places on earth, a total financial hub, has apparently already been asking the U.S. Federal Reserve for emergency swap lines out of fear of a sudden financial collapse.
Wow. Wait, I want to clarify what a swap line is because it sounds like obscure banking jargon.
Yeah, please do.
A swap line is basically a massive emergency credit card issued by the U.S. Federal Reserve. It allows foreign central banks to suddenly inject billions of U.S. dollars into their own panicked markets to prevent their local currency from completely evaporating.
Right. Which tells you the people who run the sovereign wealth funds in that region are absolutely terrified. They know that physical destruction of the oil and gas infrastructure leads to an immediate economic tailspin.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And the source notes a fascinating, devastating multiplier effect. A super El Nino weather pattern is currently building.
Oh, man. So if I'm following this, right as the global fertilizer supply gets wiped out by a geopolitical conflict, we could have a simultaneous massive climate event devastating global crop yields from the other side.
Exactly. It's the perfect storm for a global calamity. That's the economic cliff edge we're standing on right now. But to understand why the primary actors are willing to walk us right up to that edge, we really have to look at the history driving their motivations.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because if the U.S. is risking global economic collapse, the motivation has to be incredibly deep-seated.
Oh, it is.
The source frames the U.S.-Iran relationship in a way that reminds me of a corporate hostile takeover. Like, imagine a massive multinational corporation orchestrating a hostile takeover of a smaller independent business just to strip mine its assets.
Okay, I'm following.
Then the original employees violently overthrow the new corporate management and lock the doors. And for the next 40 years, the corporation is so humiliated that it spends billions trying to bankrupt the independent business from the outside.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. The analysis explicitly frames the United States fundamentally as an empire. And the mechanical rule of an empire is that it cannot tolerate a protectorate escaping its grasp without suffering massive reputational damage.
Because if you let one protectorate reclaim its resources successfully, a dozen other nations might get the exact same idea.
Precisely.
But I'm trying to square the current rhetoric with the history here. The source points to 1953 as the original sin of this conflict. But, I mean, why is a political coup from 70 years ago still dictating modern military policy?
Because that coup defined the power structure of the Middle East for a generation. In 1953, Iran was a peaceful parliamentary democracy. Their Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, suggested a very basic premise of national sovereignty, that Iran's oil should belong to Iran and not to the British Empire.
Which, of course, prompted the British MI6 to go to the newly formed American CIA, and together they operationally subverted the Iranian parliament.
Right. They ousted Mossadegh, ended the democracy, and installed the Shah. Iran effectively became a U.S. satrapy, which is a historical term for a subordinate province.
Okay.
The U.S. brought in major Western oil companies, and the Shah maintained control through a notoriously brutal secret police force known as SAVAK, which was trained and equipped by Western intelligence.
So for 26 years, the U.S. is essentially running the board. And then comes the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which is the eviction in our analogy.
Yeah, the populace rose up, threw out the Shah, and dismantled SAVAK. Now, the source frames the infamous hostage crisis that followed with a very specific context.
Right, because it wasn't just random, chaotic violence. The radical student groups were demanding that the Shah, who had actually fled to the U.S. for medical treatment, be returned to face a tribunal for 26 years of police state crimes.
Exactly. And they wanted reparations for the stolen oil wealth.
But to the United States, an empire, this is an unforgivable, highly public humiliation.
And from 1980 onward, the source argues, the U.S. has engaged in continuous economic and proxy warfare to punish Iran for escaping. The U.S. actively armed and supplied Saddam Hussein in the 1980s to invade Iran.
Wait, really?
Oh, yeah. We provided satellite intelligence and logistical support, knowing full well Saddam was using dual-use chemicals to manufacture poison gas against Iranian troops. And we've engaged in decades of intense economic sanctions designed to just suffocate their civilian economy.
The source brings this historical grudge right up to the present day, specifically analyzing Donald Trump's motivations. It claims his desire to attack Iran is fueled partly by this 46-year imperial grudge and partly by an almost delusional belief that he can execute a decapitation strike, similar to his stated views on Venezuela.
All right, a decapitation strike, theoretically, is a massive, sudden aerial bombardment targeting all the leadership nodes, command and control centers, and communication hubs of a country.
With the idea that the government will just instantly fold, allowing the attacker to seize their resources.
Exactly. But the source argues this fundamentally miscalculates the reality of Iran. I mean, this is a 5,000-year-old civilization with immense decentralized resilience. A decapitation strike wouldn't result in surrender. It would result in a massive, protracted regional war.
So what does this all mean for the rest of the Middle East? If the U.S. is driven by an imperial grudge and resource acquisition, they need a regional anchor to project that power.
Yes, they do.
And according to the source, that desire perfectly aligned with Israel's distinct long-term strategy. This brings us to a really chilling part of the analysis. The source paints Israel's strategy not as a defensive reaction, but as a deliberate demolition project.
This is where we have to unpack a very specific document from 1996. The source highlights a public strategy paper adopted by Benjamin Netanyahu when he first became prime minister. It's called the Clean Break Strategy.
Right. They were making a clean break from the Oslo peace accords, specifically the whole land for peace framework that would have inevitably led to a two-state solution with an independent Palestine.
The strategy essentially declared that Israel would never accept a Palestinian state and would maintain permanent control over the territories. But the architects of this document knew that permanent occupation would inevitably face resistance from local militant groups backed by neighboring countries.
And the core strategic shift here is what blew my mind. Instead of fighting endless, unwinnable battles against decentralized militant groups, the strategy called for overthrowing the actual sovereign governments in the region that backed them.
Yeah, the document names 7 specific countries to systematically destabilize Libya, Sudan, Somalia, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and finally, Iran.
It's just hard to wrap your head around targeting 7 sovereign nations. And Israel certainly didn't do this alone. The source points out that Israel essentially used the U.S. military as the blunt instrument to execute this plan,
Costing American taxpayers trillions of dollars through the Iraq War and various other interventions.
But I have a major question about the logic here. I mean, why would a country intentionally want to be surrounded by chaotic bloodbaths? That seems entirely counterintuitive to national security.
It does seem counterintuitive until you look at the mechanics of military threats. From Israel's strategic viewpoint, as presented in the source, regional chaos is immensely preferable to having strong, organized neighboring governments.
Oh, I see.
If your neighbors are bogged down in perpetual civil wars like we see in Syria or Libya, they cannot build a formal military coalition. They cannot purchase advanced fighter jets or sophisticated ballistic missile defense systems.
So a failed state might have militias with rifles and homemade rockets, which are a nuisance, but a unified sovereign nation has an air force and a formalized command structure, which is an existential threat.
Exactly. By dismantling the central governments around them, it ensures Israel remains the absolute, unchallenged military hegemon of the entire region.
Wow.
And the source points out that 6 of those 7 nations on the 1996 list have been turned into devastated conflict zones. Iran is simply the 7th and final target. They are essentially the final boss in this grand strategy.
But this really pushes me to ask about the psychology of the people running this strategy. Are these leaders purely calculating, cold-blooded military strategists playing a 30-year game of chess, or have they actually started believing their own extreme rhetoric?
It's a great question.
Because keeping an entire hemisphere in perpetual war seems, well, unhinged.
What's fascinating here is that the source deeply analyzes the internal ideologies currently driving the Israeli government. It is a coalition of 2 very distinct factions, both of which mathematically reject de-escalation.
Okay, let's break those down, starting with Netanyahu's faction.
So the first is the secular security-focused faction. The source describes this as a trauma-driven Sparta state mentality.
Right.
If you are a nation of roughly 9 million people surrounded by hundreds of millions of historically hostile neighbors, your doctrine shifts to pure survivalism. The core belief is every generation tries to annihilate us, so we must preemptively destroy any emerging threat.
So it's a state of perpetual preemptive warfare that has completely abandoned diplomacy as a tool of statecraft.
Exactly. That faction operates on pure calculated fear. But the second faction in this coalition is driven by something entirely different.
The religious extremism wing, right, represented by cabinet ministers like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir from the Jewish Power Party.
Yes. The source makes a crucial theological distinction here. This is not traditional ancient rabbinic Judaism, which largely preached living peacefully in exile until a Messiah arrived.
Okay.
This is a relatively new, late 20th century theological interpretation. This faction claims that God actively commands the immediate military expansion of Greater Israel, drawing heavily on a literal interpretation of the Book of Joshua.
So it's not about borders or security treaties or international law. They view taking the land and expelling the other populations as a literal divine real estate mandate.
It's viewed as a religious obligation, and the source connects this directly to massive political influence inside the United States, specifically through American Christian Zionism.
Which is wild because the theology there is entirely different, but it leads to the exact same geopolitical outcome. Why do American evangelicals care so deeply about Israeli territorial expansion?
Because of the Book of Revelation. Christian Zionism, which has massive evangelical backing and lobbying power in the U.S., supports this rapid expansion of Israel, not primarily for Jewish security, but as an accelerationist strategy.
Wait, accelerationist?
Yeah, the belief is that Jewish people must fully control the Holy Land to trigger the second coming of Christ and the end times.
Let me make sure I'm synthesizing this correctly. You have a secular Israeli faction acting out of generational trauma and a desire for regional hegemony,
Right.
allied with a domestic religious faction acting on divine entitlement. And they are backed by a superpower faction in the U.S. actively hoping to trigger the literal apocalypse.
When you lay out the mechanics of those ideologies, you immediately understand why a diplomatic off-ramp is so incredibly difficult to take. These worldviews fundamentally view compromise as either a security suicide pact or a sin against God.
Which brings us to perhaps the most alarming part of this entire deep dive.
Oh, it gets worse.
If the ideologies driving the conflict on the ground are this radical who was managing the crisis back in Washington, because reading this source felt like watching a commercial jetliner flying at 30,000 feet, but the cockpit is empty.
Yeah.
The instrument panels are completely turned off, and the plane is just flying purely on the gut vibes of whoever wanders in.
It is a terrifying absence of institutional guardrails. If we connect this to the bigger picture of historical crisis management, the contrast is stark. The source compares today's reality with how John F. Kennedy handled the Cuban Missile Crisis.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK utilized ExComm, the executive committee. He literally locked his smartest advisors in a room, demanded dissenting opinions, used secret back channels with the Soviets, and actively fought back against his own hot-headed military generals who were demanding an immediate nuclear strike.
Right, there was intense systematic deliberation. According to the analysis today, there is basically zero deliberative process. None. There are no interagency reviews weighing the economic fallout of a war with Iran. National intelligence assessments regarding the resilience of Iranian forces are apparently being ignored entirely. Decisions with the potential to trigger global catastrophe are being made on a whim or, in response to a news cycle.
What about Congress? The body that is actually constitutionally mandated to declare war.
The source argues Congress has entirely abdicating its duty. They are completely missing in action, routinely voting to strip themselves of oversight over these conflicts so they don't have to take tough votes.
Wow.
Instead, the decisions are being heavily influenced by foreign lobbying groups like AIPAC and by the personal political survival strategies of leaders like Netanyahu.
So we have decisions that move at the speed of ballistic missiles being made without data, without debate, and without constitutional checks and balances.
Right, exactly.
The source argues that we have a degraded political system, suffering from delusions of imperial grandeur, acting as if the U.S. can still unilaterally dictate terms to the entire world without facing catastrophic consequences.
So we are hurtling toward this cliff edge. What is the off-ramp? The source presents one, but it makes it very clear it isn't going to be a glorious victory lap for anyone involved.
Yeah, the off-ramp requires the U.S. to essentially swallow its imperial pride.
Yeah.
It means ending the economic warfare and sanctions, unfreezing Iran's money, allowing them to trade globally under strict, internationally monitored non-proliferation agreements,
Right.
and ultimately forcing a two-state solution to create a Palestinian state alongside Israel.
It requires acknowledging that the decades-long strategy of containment, subversion, and the clean break chaos simply failed. And for leaders whose political brands are built on projecting absolute strength, that means losing face entirely.
But the alternative is the abyss. This is where we have to bring it back to you, the listener.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to view this as abstract foreign policy happening on a chessboard thousands of miles away.
It is about the fundamental mechanics of your daily life. It's about whether you will be able to afford groceries, fill up your gas tank, or pay for healthcare a month from now.
Yeah.
The source highlights the devastating irony of a U.S. budget that proposes cutting domestic programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and childcare, while simultaneously asking for hundreds of billions of dollars in military spending to fund endless foreign interventions.
We are bleeding our domestic infrastructure dry to maintain the illusion of an empire internationally.
And if that geopolitical choke point at the Strait of Hormuz snaps, if those refineries burn and the fertilizer supply stops, that slow bleeding becomes an economic hemorrhage overnight.
We started by talking about a fork in the road, and the Strait of Hormuz acting as the main breaker switch of the global economy. I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder based on everything we've just unpacked.
Okay.
If our entire global economic system, the cost of the food we eat, and international peace relies so heavily on a single, fragile stretch of water, and on the unsupervised gut feelings of leaders driven by 40-year grudges and end-times theology, what would a truly decentralized post-empire world order even look like?
That is the big question.
And more importantly, how deeply painful is that transition going to be if we refuse to take the diplomatic off-ramp and we're forced into that new reality overnight?
That really is the defining question of our time.
Definitely something to think about next time you check the price of your groceries. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.